Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel for the first wrap up of 2023. This is of course my January wrap up. And if you caught Alan's live show where we discussed the fact that I read a bunch of his favorite books in January, then a lot of this may be old news to you because we did discuss the 5 books that Alan had assigned for me to read at the end of last year. If you didn't check out that live show, it's pretty short and it's really funny. So I will link it below and you can feel free to check that out as well. But I did still want to do a standard wrap up because there were some books that I read outside of that in January. And I get the opportunity to be a little more brief here if you don't want to sit through the entirety of that live show. So before we get started, I will just talk about the goal that I had set for myself in January and how successful that was. So I talked in my in my January TBR, I think, about how last year I had been making these really long TBR videos and I never felt like I stuck to them because I ended up not wanting to read what was on there, and then that made me feel like really trapped by what I was reading, and then I ended up reading almost nothing from my TBR. So I would make a TBR video and then maybe read like 2 or 3 books from it. So this year I endeavored to put only 5 to 6 books on each TBR, and January was an absolute success. I read 10 books in January, and I read, or at least started, because I did have one DNF in January, but I read all of the books that were on my January TBR. So I am excited about that. I did the same thing for February, and I'm hoping that this will carry me through the reading year, being able to let you guys know what I'm reading, but also leave some flexibility for me to just pick up some spontaneous reads. So I am super happy about that, and it set me out for a really good reading pace and a really good reading month. I will go through these just in the order that I read them, as I always do. I did not count up the star reviews this month, so I guess I can just try to mention them here. It looks like I had 1, 2, 3 5-star reviews and 1, 2, 4.5 stars, 1, 2, 3, 4 4 stars, and 1 3 star. So that's pretty good for a first month of the year. I feel like I read a lot of things that I really liked in January, and it just made me excited to get into my February reads. A couple of my goals for the reading year overall, well, my big goal really was to read from my physical TBR, and I did get to read. Despite the fact that this was the month that I read the books that Alan selected, I did also get to read a lot from my own physical TBR. So feeling pretty good about that as well. And we'll get into the books now. So the very first one that I read this month was Wide Sargasso Sea. And this was a buddy read with some friends on Discord. So a couple of my friends had read Jane Eyre for the first time last year. And so they were thinking about reading Wide Sargasso Sea, which is it's not a Jane Eyre retelling. It is a reimagining of one of the characters from Jane Eyre, and it talks about that character's backstory. And if you haven't read Jane Eyre, I know the plot of Jane Eyre, it's hard to spoil it because it is a classic, but I don't want to. So I won't tell you which character this perspective is from, but it's very interesting. It is a feminist reimagining of the circumstances that may have led to the story of Jane Eyre. And I really love Jane Eyre. It's one of my favorite classics, and reading this book reminded me of how much I like that book, but it also gave me a lot to think about. Reading Jane Eyre for the first time and then knowing what happens in the book is a really interesting experience, and I was having a lot of emotions from reading Wide Sargasso Sea, thinking about the characters in Jane Eyre and some of the actions that they take and some of the choices that they make. And so actually, as soon as I finished this, I downloaded the Audible exclusive version of Jane Eyre because it's a free audiobook, and started listening to that. So I didn't finish it in January because it is chunky and I just didn't have a lot of audiobook time this month, but I am almost finished. I think I have 100 pages left in Jane Eyre, and I am loving it, but reading it and Wide Sargasso Sea together has been a really rewarding experience, and I'm really glad that I picked this one up. So if you enjoy Jane Eyre, even if you hated Jane Eyre, but you'd like to critically think about the story, I would totally recommend Wide Sargasso Sea. I think it is very much worth it. It is a short volume, and it can be slow paced at times, but I think that the experience of reading adds up to more than the sum of its parts. And I feel that way a lot of the time about classics. And I would say that Wide Sargasso Sea is probably a modern classic. It is certainly literary fiction, literary criticism, deconstruction, and a worthwhile read. I'm very glad that I picked it up. After that, my second book of the month was actually a manga. So this is one that I got for Christmas from my sister, and it is called Blue Flag. And it is outside my typical range of anime / manga because it's more of like a sweet high school romance. Actually, it's not a sweet high school romance. It's more of an angsty high school romance story where there are a group of friends. So we have two male best friends and two female best friends, and they are involved in very messy interpersonal relationship dynamics. And I think that's what the entirety of the series is going to be about. But it's kind of refreshing when you're doing like gritty fantasy or really arduous literary fiction or really dense historical fiction to pick up something like this. It was a breath of fresh air for the other things that I was reading, and it was enjoyable. It certainly was compelling enough to make me want to pick up the other volumes of the manga. I can't make a lot of judgments on it because this is only the first volume, but it did endear me to the characters. I was interested in their story. I was invested in their friendships, and I am interested to see where these kind of messy relationship dynamics lead. So looking forward to that. I am going out of town this weekend, so if I can find volume 2 while I am out of town, I will pick it up and hopefully read that one next month. And that was a 4-star read as well. So those first 2 were both 4 stars for me. After that, I read Heaven Official's Blessing Volume 3. So actually, we'll do these a little bit out of order because January was the month of binge reading Heaven Official's Blessing. So I read Volume 3, 4, and 5, which are all of the up-to-date releases of the English translation of this story. I've talked about this author and this story a million times, but if this is your first time here, this is a Chinese fantasy novel or a Chinese fantasy web novel that has been translated into English. The author, MXTX, is very, very popular both in China and internationally, and a lot of her English books do become bestsellers once they're translated. So this one tells the story of a fallen god. So it is a god who has fallen from grace and a ghost king. And it talks about how their lives are intertwined and the relationship that they have and that they are building. And there is a mystery kind of at the center of the story that they're solving together. This is a really long one. This is the longest of this author's stories. And so there's a lot of complex plot building that happens in this one. The relationship moments are very tender, very sweet. I have really enjoyed that. But there's a lot of pain in this story too. This is a really painful story. A lot of difficult moments, some really gruesome scenes that are in this one, and I am enjoying it so much. The rest of the story, which I think is going to be translated in 3 more volumes, is like infinitely more painful. This is where we are transitioning into the last arc or 2 arcs of the web novel, and I already know, I have read the translation before, and I already know that it is going to be incredibly painful. But I'm looking forward to it. I really, really, really love this one, and I had a great time reading volumes 3, 4, and 5. So if you're looking for some great translated fantasy and you are interested in a combination of politics and romance, then I would highly recommend this one. After that, and for those ones, I gave them 4 stars, 4.5 stars, and then 4 stars. So I think volume 4 was my favorite of all of them. Volume 5 was probably my least favorite because it was a little bit of like side characters and it is all going to come together and be incredibly relevant, but it's just of the volumes. That one was my least favorite one. After that, we had Guards, which was another one of my audiobooks for the month. And this is a book that I gave 5 stars. This is the beginning of my journey in the City Watch books by Terry Pratchett. And I loved this book. I was expecting to really like it because I loved the Death books. But if I'm being honest, I did not expect to love the City Watch as much as I liked the Death books because I love some of the characters in Death. I love the themes that are explored in the Death books and like police type stories, investigators, like those types of stories are not usually my favorite thing, but this was delightful. It is certainly the most plot heavy of the Terry Pratchett books that I've read so far, which admittedly have not been that many since I've only read the death ones in Discworld. But it still had that trademark humor, the wordplay, the characters were delightful. There were no new characters because all of these characters had popped up at some point or another in the death books, even if it was for like the very briefest of moments. Or at least most of them have. I guess like there were some secondary characters that were new, but it was really nice to see the origins of some of the characters who had really funny moments in some of the death books, and it was really hard not to fall in love with everybody. Lady Sybil, I love Lady Sybil. She is an aristocrat in Ankh-Morpork, and she is a dragon expert and just like the nicest, kindest, most big-hearted character that I have met so far in Discworld, and I loved every single moment that she was on the page. This made me laugh out loud many, many times, and I already have a hold put on book 2 from the library, so as soon as the second book gets in, I will continue on. I am determined to get through the entirety of the City Watch subseries this year, and I am just really, really enjoying it. So glad that I picked that one up this month. So thank you to Alan for that one. After that, I read Ogres, which is a novella by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and I also gave this one 5 stars. I think that Ogres may be my favorite novella that I have ever read, and it just cements for me the incredible range that Adrian Tchaikovsky has as an author, because I've only read 4 things by him, and they have all been incredibly different, but so enjoyable. Whether it is fantasy with a historical feel, whether it's hard sci-fi, whether it is that kind of sci-fi fantasy combination, or when it comes to Ogres, like pure, I don't even know if this is pure fantasy, but more fantasy leaning for sure. It's just so good. It is so enjoyable. He does a great job of making you think about the world and the characters and their choices and how everybody impacts one another and what it means to be a people and a society. Like, he is an incredibly talented author. His output is phenomenal, and everything just feels really unique. I have another book of his lined up to read in February because I just keep being impressed by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I know I haven't said a lot about Ogres itself, but it's because it's a book that's good to go in without knowing a lot. It is a novella, so it's short, and it surprises you so many times that I think it's nice to go in knowing nothing. What you need to know probably is that it is told in second person, so that requires a little bit of adjustment, especially since most of us, I would say, are not used to reading in that tense or from that perspective. And it follows a young man who has to make a series of difficult choices. And it is told from this point of view, or it's told in this style that withholds a lot of information, and you're finding out new things as you go through the narrative. And as you discover new things, your perspective on the story changes. And it is phenomenal. I really loved it. I would highly encourage everyone to read it. Even if you don't like it, I think you would have to admit that it's some really clever storytelling and feels really different from anything else that you have read. So if you've read Ogres, please let me know if you liked it. And if you haven't read Ogres, please go read it and then come back and tell me what you thought about it, because I would love for everyone to do that. After that was my debut book that I read in January, and I did a review for this one. So if you haven't watched that review, feel free to check it out. And that is The Daughters of Izdahar. And I gave this one 4.5 stars. Like I said, this was a debut novel for January. And it's basically an Egyptian-inspired fantasy that deals with elemental magic and the topic of women's suffrage. It has 2 female main characters, both of whom can use elemental magic, and each of them have a very different relationship to the use of magic and their power specifically. And it follows their story and how the circumstances of their lives push them in similar directions and helps to change the face of the city that they live in. It's really fast-paced, very plot-driven. It is a debut novel, and the writing can be a little bit clunky at times. So if you're someone who needs to go in for like very beautiful, poetic, or stylized prose, then this probably won't be the book for you. But if you love getting like riled up in this being upset about injustice kind of way, and you like a cool magic system, and you want to discover a new fantasy setting that isn't explored as often in really popular fantasy novels, then I highly, highly recommend The Daughters of Izdahar. I had a great time reading it. I will absolutely buy the next book as soon as it comes out. This is going to be a duology, and I will reread the first one and then read the second one right away. That is how much I enjoyed this book. And then after The Daughters of Izdahar, we had Senlin Ascends. So sadly, this was my lowest rated book for the month. I gave this one 3 stars. Senlin Ascends is a booktube darling. It was a self-pub book by Josiah Bancroft that gained incredible popularity online and then was picked up and traditionally published. And it is made up of all of the things that I should love. It is genre blendy. It's this funky blend of like steampunk, fantasy, mystery, horror, and I really should have loved it. It is about a naive man named Thomas Senlin who travels to the Tower of Babel with his new wife for their honeymoon. And Senlin himself is a very naive character, and the outside world has very little idea of what this tower is like. And so once Senlin arrives at the tower, he loses track of his wife and he has to try to find her once again so that they can be reunited. And all of his beliefs about the tower are going to be challenged as he tries to find his wife. So it's really hard. And I had a hard time explaining this on the live show with Alan as well. I had a hard time explaining what exactly I didn't like about this book. I just thought that the pacing was a little bit off for me. There were some parts that I found really compelling, and then there were other parts that seemed to drag. I just never seemed to want to pick it up. It took me 3 weeks to read this book, and it's only about 350 pages, which is a really long time for me personally. And I never felt very attached to Senlin. There are some excellent secondary female characters, so Josiah Bancroft can craft a really well-written female fantasy character. I am going to continue reading on just because I found some of the side characters so compelling, but it was a disappointment for me, and I'm really sad to say that. I am hopeful that I will like the subsequent books of Babel a little bit more, and I will certainly give book 2 a try. If that totally pulls me in, then I'll be all in on the series. If I feel the same way about book 2, then I probably will end up not continuing, but you can't love all the books that everybody else loves, which is a hard fact for me to accept because I really like liking things. I don't want to dislike the things that everybody else likes, but unfortunately this one just did not work for me. And then the very last book of the month, which is probably my favorite book of the month. I think it is. I think it does edge out Guards just because it's more of my preferred taste, and that is The Folding Knife by KJ Parker. This is one that I also gave 5 stars. I love this book, and I don't know who else would love this book. I think if you're someone who loves Robin Hobb for her complex character exploration and her slower paced novels, then you may end up liking The Folding Knife. If you're someone who likes grimdark fantasy, not for the gruesome battles or the like dark dialogue and character interactions, but for the kind of bleakness and cynicism, like that way of looking at the world that isn't incredibly optimistic. And if you like characters who are really, really smart, probably smarter than you, smarter than me, I don't know who else, but smarter than me for sure, then I think you would like The Folding Knife. It was so compelling. It is a book that should be really boring. Like, it's a book that I shouldn't have liked as much as I did, because it's just about this man named Basso who is the head of a bank and has aspirations. He wants to be an important person. And it's just about him and his life and running his bank and how that leads to a change in the political landscape, how he changes the world based on the decisions that he's making. And he is a terrible person. Like, he is a sociopath, but good things happen because of the decisions that he makes. And it's so fascinating to watch that play out. So interesting. This is super compelling, and especially compelling considering it should be a book that is really boring. And if you found it really boring, I would understand, but I cannot recommend this highly enough. If you like the same books that I do, if you enjoy those 3 things that I talked about, then at least give The Folding Knife a try. Like, I just would love to have more people to talk about this book with, because I loved it so much. We'll absolutely be diving into more KJ Parker as quickly as possible. But that's it. Those are all of the books that I read in January. I have 2 books that are ongoing. So like I said, I had Jane Eyre that I have about 100 pages left in. That is the audiobook that I'm listening to right now. And I also am maybe a third of the way through The Trouble with Peace by Joe Abercrombie. And I'm super excited to finish that one and hopeful that I'll be able to read the 3rd one next month. The book that I DNF'd for the month was Sharpe's Tiger by Bernard Cornwell. And again, this was a case of like me, not the book. I was not enjoying the setting. This is set during the time of the Napoleonic Wars, but it's actually set in India. So we follow the British Army as they are in India. And I just was not liking it. I was not liking the premise. I was not liking the setting. Parts of it, reading it, were making me really angry, and not in a like, I think that there was anything wrong with what Bernard Cornwell was writing, but just like the subject matter itself was just making me more enraged than engaged. So I put it down. There are a lot of people who have really loved this book, including Alan over at the Library of Alexandria. I'm sure that there are lots of people that you can find really good reviews from, but unfortunately it just didn't work for me, and I can't see myself committing to a 24 book series when I was really not enjoying the first one. So I probably will give Bernard Cornwell's other series a try, because I do like that more kind of Norse/Viking inspired setting more than the Flintlock kind of real world setting. So we will give that a try, and I will see you with another video soon. I don't know why I'm trying to end this so quickly. I didn't say any of my usual things, but please tell me what you read in January. Did you have a good start to your reading month? Did you enjoy what you read? Have you read any of these books? Etc., etc. And I will see you with another video soon. Bye.